Hello, and welcome to Dining with Death, True Crime Tuesday. Whew, you guys are really making me work for these lesser known stories, and let me tell you, I worked on this one. I couldn't find a single YouTube video covering this case. There isn't even a Wikipedia page for these crimes. I did find a short film trailer from 2018. I don't think the film ever got made. And other than that, there's barely anything online. Not a one video on this guy. There is very little in the press, but you guys are always telling me that you want stories you've never heard before. And you know I'm always going to try my best to give you what you want. So this episode might be a little shorter today than usual because there is simply not a lot of information out there, but I've done my best. This is the story of serial killer Howard Belcher, the Necktie Killer. Let's get into it. October 5th, 2002. A call comes in to the Atlanta, Georgia Police Department. 40-year-old Mark Schaller has failed to report to work, which was very uncharacteristic for Mark. His co-workers know him well, and they're concerned. At first, they believe he just might be late. Perhaps he had car trouble. But when an hour goes by, and then two, they know something is very, very wrong. After an entire day of trying to get a hold of Mark, Mark's co-workers make that phone call and tell the police what has happened. They ask the police to go to Mark's house and do a welfare check on him. Two police officers arrive at Mark Schaller's home and make their way inside. Immediately upon entering, the stench of natural gas hits them in the face. They go to the kitchen and see that all 4 natural gas burners on the stove are on, and they can hear the clicking the burners make when the gas is first turned on. One of the police officers turns off the burners on the stove as they both begin going through the house. Obviously, there is something very strange going on. They walk here through the living room. Everything seems to be in order. As you can see, Mark's computer is still in its place. The house is not ransacked, and there is no sign of violence. The officers continue down the hall to the first bedroom. They don't see anything. They pass the laundry room and the guest bath, and then they come to the main bedroom of the condominium. This bedroom right here. Again, at first glance, there is no sign of struggle. The bathroom appears normal and usual, and nothing is out of place in the bedroom. But as they walk around the bed to the side you cannot see from the entry, the police officers find Mark Schaller. He is lying on his stomach right next to the bed, and he has been murdered. His hands were tied behind his back with neckties taken from the closet, and there is a gag in his mouth tied around his head. It is also a necktie taken from his own closet. A forensics team is called to the crime scene, and police begin to question neighbors. One of them tells police that Mark's car is missing, so police put out a bolo, a be on the lookout for the car. Police continued to question neighbors the following morning, and they all say the same thing about Mark. He was a very nice guy, the perfect neighbor, a hard worker who everyone liked. No one could come up with any reason that someone might want to kill him. Mark worked as a software engineer. He was smart, he was happy, and he was successful. Mark's body was sent in for an autopsy. The results come back as expected. Mark had been strangled. There was no ligature marks on the outside of his neck, so it was determined that he had been strangled manually. The killer had used his hands. Mark's wallet had been taken from the crime scene, so investigators pull Mark's bank records. No money has been taken from Mark's bank account. Police do see something that helps, though. The night of his murder, Mark had been at Bad Dogs, a popular gay nightclub in the area. Mark was openly gay, so the fact that he was at a gay nightclub was no surprise. The fact did, however, give investigators somewhere to start. They went to Bad Dogs and asked around. No one told them anything that could help them. No one claimed to remember seeing Mark Schaller, or if they did see him, they didn't want to talk to the police about it. One day after Mark's murder, a call comes into the police. The caller is reporting an abandoned car parked illegally. The tags were run, and it was confirmed the car belonged to Mark Schaller. A forensics team was brought in to inspect the car and run tests. There were 2 cigarette butts found in the ashtray. The cigarettes were sent into the lab for testing. While investigators waited for those results, a call came in from Mark's bank. Someone had just used Mark's credit cards. Most of the charges were coming from gas stations all around Atlanta. Police went to those gas stations, but unfortunately, of the 3 gas station charges were made at, none of them had working surveillance cameras. So the police decided to begin watching gas stations in the area to see if they could catch whoever it was using Mark's credit cards. The bank agreed to follow Mark's cards 24 hours a day live, and if there was a charge, they would immediately alert the police. As the police were watching, 2 men pulled up at a midtown gas station. The bank put out an alert over the police radio that they were using Mark's cards. The police rush in and arrest the 2 men. As the men sit in handcuffs, they identify themselves as Ed Thomas and Frank Williams. The police take the 2 men into custody. Back at police headquarters, they are interviewed. Ed Thomas told police that he knew nothing about the cards. He was simply driving the car. Another thing about Ed Thomas, he didn't have any criminal history. Frank Williams was a different story. He had a criminal arrest, but he told police he wouldn't speak with them. Frank Williams was charged with credit card fraud, and police took his DNA to compare it to the DNA taken from the cigarette butts. That same night, as the police waited for results on both tests, another call comes into dispatch. There has been another murder. October 10th, 2002. 27-year-old Leroy Tyler's mother calls the police. She is concerned because she cannot get a hold of her son. She has been calling and there has been no answer. So the police agree to do a welfare check on Leroy. They arrive here at the home. Again, things look to be in usual order. Leroy is not in the front room or the den, but then they find him in his bedroom. Just like with Mark Schaller, Leroy is lying on his stomach face down. He is dead. His hands are tied behind his back with his own neckties, and he has a belt around his neck. After the crime scene is documented, Leroy is sent for autopsy to ensure the assumed cause of death, manual strangulation, is correct. As police look a little closer through the bedroom, they see that there are, in fact, some drawers pulled out. The computer monitor has been moved, and it becomes apparent that someone has gone through the bedroom, possibly looking for valuables. A police officer then calls from the kitchen. Again, just like in Mark Schaller's murder, all 4 burners on the kitchen stove had been turned on high and the gas was on. Again, like at the first crime scene, Leroy's wallet and his car have been taken. Police now know they are looking for a serial killer who has attempted to burn down both murder sites. Luckily, he has failed. Police dusted for fingerprints and found some here on the door jamb, and they also found footprints on the bathroom floor. All of this was sent in for testing. Leroy had just graduated from mortuary school. He was just starting out in life. He was on his way to a successful career. People say he was the life of the party. He was someone everyone liked. Again, no one could figure out who would want to hurt someone like Leroy. But they knew one thing for sure. It wasn't Frank Williams, the man from the gas station using Mark Schaller's cards. Frank had been sitting in jail when Leroy was murdered. Now that, of course, did not explain how he got Mark's cards. Finally, when Frank was questioned again, he said he was given the cards by basically a street person. He said the man was black, average height, and he didn't know his name. Leroy's autopsy came back. Just as police thought, he had been strangled. This time, they believe Leroy had allowed the belt to be placed around his neck as part of autoerotic asphyxiation, but his partner didn't stop and instead used the belt to kill Leroy. A few days after Leroy's autopsy results came back, the DNA tests on the cigarette butts found in Mark's car came back. The DNA on the cigarettes did not belong to Mark Schaller. Police then believed it belonged to his killer. Unfortunately, the fingerprints found at Leroy's murder scene were inconclusive. They could not be matched to anything in the system. Police were working around the clock on the murders. There was information coming in and going out very quickly, and they were putting in overtime trying to find the killer when he struck again. October 11th, 2002. 45-year-old Matthew Abney, an assistant manager at Walmart, hadn't been heard from for a couple of days. His sister became concerned about him and went to his apartment. She let herself inside and began calling out for Matthew to answer, but he did not. She walked through the house. He wasn't in the kitchen and he wasn't in the living room, but then she saw a blanket in the middle of the floor. She walked over and carefully pulled it back. Under the blanket was her brother Matthew, lying face down on his stomach, with his hands tied behind his back with neckties. An additional necktie was tied around his head and used as a gag. There was also a telephone cord mixed in with the neckties. Strangely, none of the bindings were very tight. They didn't look as though they had been used to actually bind Matthew, but placed there more as an afterthought, perhaps because someone wanted to see what he would look like bound with them. Matthew had bruises on his neck and throat. He had been strangled. Again, the oven door was open and all 4 burners on the stove were running on high. Again, Matthew's wallet and car were missing. The serial killer was working fast, faster than the police could work the case. A task force was quickly formed and officers from other departments were brought in to help. None of the victims had anything in common. They didn't know each other. They didn't work together. They didn't even live in the same areas of the city. The press was aware of the murders, and the third one really sent people over the edge. The LGBTQ community was terrified, and police were feeling the pressure. Finding this killer was their #1 priority. Like Mark and Leroy, Matthew had no known enemies. He was close with his family. He was well liked, and he was generally happy. Matthew's sister did tell the police that Matthew had been doing some remodeling, and she didn't know the men that were working on the house. Police then began investigating all of the men doing that remodeling. They find one with a criminal record, and he agrees to give his DNA. He is not a match, and they're back to square one. A few days later, as police are going back through their list of family and friends, one of Matthew's family members tells police something that immediately gets their attention. Matthew liked to go to Bad Dogs, the same gay bar Mark liked to hang out at. Police believe this to be more than a coincidence. The police return to Bad Dogs, and again, they leave empty-handed. No one recognizes Matthew. I have a hard time believing that nobody recognized any of these men, but because of the nature of gay bars, sometimes people are reluctant to talk to the police, and I wish that would change. If someone's been murdered, there really isn't anything hiding that is more important than finding clues to who might have done it, you know? Then a patrol officer comes upon Matthew Abney's car abandoned in an empty parking lot, but this time it's not just the car that is found. This time, there are items outside the car. There are some articles of clothing here, some socks thrown in the bushes here, and a pair of shoes next to the clothing. All of these items are carefully collected and sent for testing. The lab finds hair on several of them. It has now been 3 weeks since the first victim, Mark Schaller, was found, and although police do have some clues, they do not know who their serial killer is. As the investigation drags on, another murder is committed. October 28, 2002. 35-year-old Artillis McKinney, who went by Art, is found dead in his bed by his friend after the friend returned home from the gym. As this friend and roommate called to Art, he got no reply, so he entered Art's bedroom. As you can see from the photos, there is nothing really out of place. The apartment looks very typical and normal, but it was unusual for Art not to answer back. As his friend continued into the bedroom, he found Art lying on his stomach, dead. This time, there were no neckties, but it appeared that Art had been strangled. Again, Art's wallet, his car, and his cell phone were missing. Again, all 4 burners on the stove were left on high, and the oven was on as well, with the door open. Police did a full forensic search of the bedroom. Hairs and fibers were lifted at the scene, and as the investigation continued, Art's aunt contacted the police and told them that she had received some strange phone calls from a man claiming to be Art's friend. This friend, who called himself Keontae at one point and Tiante at another point, told Art's aunt that Art was leaving the country and wouldn't be back for some time. This was very strange and out of character for Art, and so of course when he was found murdered, his aunt knew she had to tell the police about these phone calls she'd received. She also tells the police that all of the calls made to her from this supposed friend came from Art's phone. Art's aunt then tells police that Art has a friend named Chris Clancy that makes her uncomfortable. This aunt calls Chris intimidating and tells the police that he makes her nervous. So the police go to look for Chris Clancy. They also put a trace on Art's phone, hoping that the killer will use it again. And about that same time, a strange call comes into the police department. The coroner has called to tell them that Artillas McKinney's cause of death cannot be determined. There is not enough evidence to classify the death as a homicide, and the coroner has no choice but to officially label the manner of death as undetermined. Now, I don't really know the details of why that is. I know there are some markers, some touchstones that have to be present in order to label a death a strangulation, and maybe that evidence just wasn't there. Police find Chris Clancy at work and ask him when he last saw Art McKinney. Chris tells investigators that Art called him the day he was murdered and asked him to go out clubbing with him that night. Chris couldn't go. Police asked Chris what was the name of the club Art wanted you to go with him to. Chris couldn't remember. Police asked Chris to give his fingerprints, and Chris agrees to do so. At the same time police are talking to Chris Clancy in another part of town, a patrol officer has pulled over a black man driving Art McKinney's car, a 1994 Lexus. Dispatch is on the line as the officer verifies that it is, in fact, the stolen vehicle belonging to a murdered man. The police officer knew the likelihood of the man driving the car being the serial killer was very high, so he pulled his weapon and ordered the driver out of the car. The man surrenders without a struggle as the officer calls for backup. The driver is placed in handcuffs and the arresting officer pulls out the ID from his wallet. The driver of the car is Howard Belcher. Howard tells the police that the car isn't stolen, that it belongs to his friend, but he mispronounces the name. Howard calls the owner Achilles, and in fact the name is Artillas. As the arresting officer searches Howard Belcher, he makes a shocking but important discovery. Howard Belcher is carrying Matthew Abney's wallet with Matthew's ID inside. So Howard Belcher is arrested for driving a stolen vehicle and he's taken in for questioning. Immediately, Howard Belcher blames this mystery man, Keontae, the same name used by the man who called Artilla's aunt. The police aren't buying it at all. Hair and DNA is taken from Howard Belcher and sent in for rapid DNA testing. They get a perfect match. It is Howard Belcher's DNA on the cigarette butts taken from Mark Schaller's car. It is Howard Belcher's hair found on the clothing found by Matthew Abney's car. It is all a perfect match. Police have caught their serial killer. Howard Belcher is then arraigned and a trial date is set. Prosecutors begin to build a case against Howard Belcher, who the media is now calling the Necktie Killer. The prosecution states to the jury that Howard Belcher picked up his victims at Bad Dogs. He would go home with them, get them to trust him, to relax, and then he would strangle them and rob them, taking their wallets and their vehicles. The jury listened to the case and very quickly returned with a verdict of guilty. At sentencing, Howard Belcher told the judge, "I want to thank you for giving me the death penalty." He said he was angry with society. He was angry with God. He was angry with people who hated him for being gay, and that he wanted to get back at society. I'm not sure how you get back at society by killing your fellow gay men, Howard, but who knows what is in the mind of this monster. The judge took a different route, and on June 22, 2004, he sentenced Howard to life in prison. This is what Howard Belcher looks like now. He is 44 years old and is incarcerated at Phillips State Prison in Georgia. He will never leave. My heart goes out to the men that he killed. Their loved ones went through a lot, especially those that found them. And I, for one, am glad that Howard Belcher is locked away for good. Thank you for joining me today on Dining with Death, True Crime Tuesday. Hit the like button if you liked the video and subscribe to my channel if you'd like to support me. You can also support me by joining my Patreon. The ultimate goal there is to raise money to donate to police departments that have cold case DNA in storage that can't be tested because there's no money to test it. By joining Patreon, a small donation can help us reach those goals. Stay safe, my friends, and be kind to each other. And I'll see you next time on Dining with Death. Bye.